Hey, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be my first video discussing the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and specifically his theory of civilization is going to be the focus. Now, this is largely going to be derived from his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, but I'm also going to be drawing from a lot of earlier philosophy, and as well a lot of earlier work of his, as Civilization and Its Discontents was published quite late in Freud's career as a psychoanalyst, and it's sort of the culmination of all of his theories, more or less. So I'm going to give this quite complicated thesis statement of what civilization is for Freud, and then I'm going to break that down. And then hopefully by the end of the video, you understand the thesis statement. Start out, we'll say that civilization for Freud is this dialectic between the pull of a death drive and a life drive. And within this death drive and life drive would be the civilization as a whole, which is being pulled by it, but as well as the individual themselves. So that's going to be the thesis. So to start, we're going to discuss how is civilization formed for Freud. So civilization is formed for Freud out of a state of nature. Now this is kind of intuitively assumed to be the Hobbesian state of nature, as Freud specifically says there's a war of all against all, which is a specific Hobbes quote. He just doesn't quote Hobbes. You can also say that because he speaks about the aggression which is inherent in man, this is, and its sense for mastery, that quest for power, which is very Hobbesian as well. This is the Hobbesian state of nature that Freud is speaking of. But I think he goes further than this, because Freud derives some sort of natural potential in man for creativity and for work. But we're going to go back to the Hobbesian state of nature, and then we'll expand on that point. So, from the Hobbesian state of nature, Freud develops this sort of myth, you could say, or fiction, known as basically the, we'll say, the myth of the totem. So we can kind of compare this to Plato's idea of the mythos. The mythos is like a likely story or a likely myth. This would be used in reference to his myth of the afterlife, the myth of the immortal soul, the myth of the judges which judge you and prescribe you punishment 10 times what you deserve from what you did in life, all of that. But Freud, yeah, he takes this idea of myth, I think, and he applies it to try and form this anthropological record of the beginning of civilization. So this is derived from his book Totem and Taboo, which was sometime in the early 1910s. And Totem and Taboo, basically, the last chapter is where this focus on this sort of fiction is developed, where Freud believes that there was the many families in this primitive society, you could say. So primitive means before civilization, before unity of man. This primitive society had many families, and these families were in a constant vial for power, because again, this is sort of assumed that this quest for power is inherent in man, again drawing from Hobbes. So this quest for power is sort of carried out in this familial dynamic, which would be known as the Oedipal complex for Freud. And the word Oedipal complex is far more elucidated upon in his later work. It's developed in his earlier work, but it's, I believe, given the most power in his later work. So there's this Oedipal complex, this familial battle for power, basically. And basically, the primal horde kills the figure of the paternal agency, which had the power at that point, and then the primal horde gains power. But because of this killing, they feel this sense of guilt. And the sense of guilt, Freud believes, is the institution of ethics, and sort of the first case of some sort of unity formed between man. And at this point, to resolve themselves of that guilt, they create a totem object. I don't want to get too anthropological here, but basically, when Freud was writing, there was a couple of very British anthropologists, one of them named Fraser, who wrote in 1910, about this distinction between totemism and then this totem object. So the totem object would be this sort of spiritual valuation that you place upon a dead enemy of an opposite tribe or something. And we don't deal with that term in modern anthropology. We've now drawn a distinction between totemism and animism, but that is sort of out of the purview of this video. But so he deals with the work of anthropology available at his time, and so this spiritual value is given to this killing of the paternal agency, which then gives the brothers that sense of power and then that sense of mastery, you could say. Now, at this point, we are now led to what does this totem mean? So for Freud, this is that unity which is established within man. These brothers all bear that guilt. And Freud actually believed that this guilt was passed down through the collective unconscious through civilization. We'll get to that later. But so these brothers all bear this guilt, which is the beginning of the killing of that other, you could say. And this is that aggression which is inherent in man, Freud believes. So, from this, they build that unity, and that unity is the foundational bedrock of civilization. Okay, cool. We got civilization now. That's great. Now, the totem object also represents the beginning of religion as well. So, we can draw some connections to Christianity here with this idea of the original son passed down through Adam, through the seed or sperm of man, passed down to each developing generation. And this original sin is that Adam disobeyed God and all that. So this would be kind of, Freud was an avid reader of the Bible in his youth. Being a Jew himself, he did read the Torah and as well the Bible. So he understood a lot of these religious concepts, even though he was a vehement atheist. But he understood the Bible quite a lot. And so I believe he kind of derived this from the concept of original sin and then sort of distanced himself because he was kind of very against this whole Christendom, basically. The society of Christianity, basically, you could say. So he distanced himself from this, but he kept this idea of original sin, this guilt of killing the paternal agency or the authority, which is passed down through humanity. Okay, so that's religion for Freud. We have civilization, we have religion established, and they're both through the same thing, the killing of that paternal agency, okay? This is that guilt, which is prescribed among man, creates that unity. Great. Okay, now we're going to get into what is civilization, how is it continued? So we have civilization, we have that unity among man instituted by that guilt. Now we can refer to this guilt as the superego for Freud. So the superego is a term that came about in his book, Id and Ego, and it was also mid-1910s. And so the superego is that mechanism of guilt, which the mechanism of guilt or the blockage of following that pure drive in humans, you could say. So that pure drive would be that aggression. Now, we're going to get to these two topics now. We have the life principle, or the pleasure principle, or the life drive, and the death drive, or thanatos. What is the pleasure principle for Freud? Well, the pleasure principle is basically that we desire to be happy. Freud thinks that we like being happy rather than unhappy. And as such, he says that, well, in general, humans do actions to be happy. But this is really only in his early work. Because in 1919, he writes this book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is this radical split in psychoanalysis, which is very, very controversial still, whether to affirm the death drive. So the death drive for Freud is the sense that we all desire unconsciously to return to that state of non-being. A state of non-being is without suffering. It is that like pure happiness, that mythical sense of fulfillment, you could say. And so we desire this for Freud, and as Freud says, that all that is desires to return to non-being, or wants to return to non-being, depending on the translation you're looking at. So that's kind of the idea of death drive. Now, what does this mean in the context of civilization? So this life drive is that continuance for the unity among man to continue that pleasure, because you can only have this long-lasting sense of pleasure in civilization. But there's this underside to this, okay? So you have this longer-lasting sense of pleasure in civilization because, again, state of nature is aggression, everyone's killing each other, very Hobbesian. But there's this underside because repression has to be introduced here, because Freud believes that your happiness can be, in the short term, you would have higher happiness or a higher degree of pleasure in the state of nature. But as such, we sacrifice this higher notion of happiness, for that sense of security. Again, very Hobbesian. And as such, we take that security because we desire that sense of long-term happiness. Basically, Freud says, hey, I like being happy. I'm going to assume you like being happy. Therefore, we should continue our happiness by forming this unity and continuing the pleasure principle. Now we're getting to the death drive, though. So what is the death drive? As I've said, it is that returning to non-being, that unconscious longing for returning to non-being. And for Freud, this would take the form and repetition in our daily lives. So these daily tasks that we repeat on end, not really knowing why we're doing so, sort of a habitual being in the world. As such, people might wake up and brush their teeth every day at a specific time, and then they wake up at a specific time, and all of this, Freud believes, is to try and alleviate yourself from this continuance of pure pleasure, because Freud was not some sort of like emancipatory thinker in terms of pleasure. This happened later in psychoanalysis with William Reich, who believed that capitalism distorted desire, and then this was further continued by Gilles Deleuze and the Frenchies, like Nietzschean offshoot from psychoanalysis, which became its own thing, but that's a completely different subject. But this wasn't really a concept in Freud. Freud was a very prudent man, meaning he was a prude. He didn't believe in this pure sexual exploration, and this is just something which is told by people that haven't actually read Freud, as most people that speak about him haven't read him, and so they have these concepts in their head, which are really a simulacra, meaning that they are a copy of something which never existed in the first place. They are told these concepts by other people who haven't read Freud. This creates a copy of something which never existed. So this would be the, in relation to his idea of that Freud's this sexual explorational thinker. And unironically, this was a Nazi propagandist point. If you peddle this, you're peddling Nazi propaganda. That Freud was this thinker that we should have pure sexual exploration. This is a pure Nazi propaganda. So yeah, maybe don't peddle that. But back to what I was saying, we can go back to, again, this death drive. That is this underlying sense of returning to non-being. And this would be that sense of self-destruction, which is that repression from that aggression which once existed in the state of nature. As such, the state of nature has that aggression upon man to man. When you repress it, it becomes that self-destruction. So we've now gone into some issues with civilization, Freud believes. There's that repression, but that repression is needed to have civilization, to have that long-term happiness. And earlier I touched upon the idea of this potentiality for work and creativity. And I view this as a very Marxian point, actually, where Marx believed that there is this potentiality within man to be a creative animal, to actualize themselves, but that capitalism would restrict that, and that was kind of whole Marx's project, that capitalism restricted that potentiality for man to actualize his creative potential. As such, communism needs to be established. The dissolution of classes and commodity, fetishism and all that would need to be established to further allow the potentiality of man to be actualized. And tracking further back, this is actually a concept from Aristotle, Aristotle's idea of potential versus the actual. So there's this potentiality within man for Marx, and this actual is the actualization of communism. And again, Aristotelian bend to Marx, but Marx was quite Aristotelian because he derived from Hegel quite a lot, and Hegel was a big fan of Aristotle. So I've gone off track here a little bit, but I'm going to get back to the life and death drive. So life and death drive, if you want to give a Hegelian twist to this, and Freud was not a fan of Hegel, he mentioned Hegel twice in all of his work, and it wasn't very happy. It doesn't seem he read Hegel. He seems he heard a couple of things, maybe from some professors in college, and they just kind of inferred from there. But what Freud says seems a lot to me like the Hegelian dialectic, where this thing itself contains the contradiction, or the object contains the contradiction, where you have the object of civilization, which is that happiness, which is we desire happiness, as I said, that unity among man creates the long-term happiness, but the underside of that contradiction is that sense of self-destruction, that sense of returning to non-being, that sense of returning to the state of nature. And that is that dialectical point in Freud, which I believe is beautiful and that he didn't touch on. because he didn't read Hegel. But I think that this is beautiful in Freud, where you have this dialectical point of the within the thing itself, within the object itself, civilization, there's that contradiction entailed, that contradiction being the life drive and the death drive, or the pleasure principle and the thanatos or death drive. And that's very important in Freud. So we've touched on the Marxian, the Aristotelian, and we've talked all about the life drive, death drive dialectic in Freud. One thing I'll finally touch upon is some things that he says where you kind of feel this sense of what Martin Heidegger would later talk about in the question concerning technology, where there's this thing that technology or civilization creates its own problems and then tries to solve them. Freud gives an exact example where he says that if railroads didn't exist, like railroads, trains, if railroads didn't exist, my son would never move away from me, there would be no need for the telephone. As such, this retroactivity of the telephone is needed because civilization has allowed railroads to exist. So Freud goes, okay, my son would never move away if we didn't have railroads. Therefore, the telephone was needed to correct this. But civilization itself brought the problem that it is trying to correct. So this would be Freud doesn't use the word contradiction, but this would be a contradiction of civilization. As such, this is getting a little bit far off. We're going into a little bit of kind of post-Hegelian philosophy. Maybe you could look at the work of On Contradiction by Mao Zedong. Mao was terrible, etc., but these are his metaphysics are interesting to read about. So Mao believed in the sustained contradiction. You could say that civilization for Freud is the sense of sustained contradiction, the sense of continued contradiction, because civilization creates its own problems and then tries to solve them. Civilization is that dialectic between the life drive and the death drive, but that this is a sustained contradiction because it doesn't seem civilization is breaking apart fully. It's this constant denigrating and regenerating. You could say this degenerating and regenerating is the idea of pleasure in Plato. Plato believes that man is in a neutral state of neutrality or whatever, and pleasure requires this regeneration, which always leads to degeneration because man is reverting back to his neutral state. Perhaps for Freud, you could say that the pleasure principle would be this sort of regeneration, which always reverts back to that neutral state. And that neutral state for Freud would be the reality principle, that we have to repress our pleasure, our desire for pleasure, for the reality in this world, for the existence in this world among others. And this would be work for Freud. As such, work is not always love, but it's not always desired. But work is that repressed pleasure, which finds its actualization in creativity. So, I've kind of laid out a lot of ideas here that Freud doesn't really get to fully, but that I believe that from philosophical backing I can justify. And this is why I believe that Freud's theory of civilization is quite intriguing. Of course, I don't believe in this sense of the primal family, this fiction, which Freud admits himself in Totem and Taboo, and here where he's like, maybe this isn't true, but this seems most practical to me at the time. So he's like, maybe in the future this will be disproven and we'll find this sort of source of religion, which anthropologists haven't found. There is no ultimate source of religion. Anthropology has largely abandoned that since the 1970s. Again, I don't want to go too much into anthropology, but we've abandoned this sort of uniformity, this search of uniformity in man's beginning. This isn't really something which we believe exists. We believe that there is many different religions which have developed at various times, which were not always totems. Some places in the world started with some sort of monotheistic god, some sort of animistic god, meaning that there was some sort of spirit from the land itself or from the animal, which was then animated, animism, or illuminated in the object. So we have these far more complex theories of anthropology now, which Freud didn't have access to at the time. So of course, if you live in 2022, you should reject Freud's whole primal schema or whatever. But it's an interesting thought experiment. And I do agree with the Hobbesian state of nature. I do believe that there wasn't a world of all against all. It was not uniformal, as Hobbes himself says in Leviathan. He says that there was no, he isn't under the illusion that this was a worldwide phenomenon, the state of nature, but that in various societies this seemed to crop up. And he gives the example of the Native Americans at the time he's writing, and I think Leviathan was 1653 it came out. So he's writing about the Native Americans in America, and he says that they're in the state of nature. He talks about Africans too, which is quite racist, probably. But it's 1653. I mean, I don't really know if we're going to apply our modern understandings of race to someone from that time, but probably was quite racist. He intended it. But he believes that the state of nature did exist in various places across the world, similar to Freud, but that Hobbes didn't believe in this uniformity, which Freud believed in uniformity, that there was this primal schema which instituted religion and civilization and guilt. And I reject this, of course. This is silly to me, and I agree with modern anthropology on those things, so I'm not gonna lead people under the illusion that this is correct, but this is just Freud's work. And you know, when you read a thinker, you read things that you disagree with, but you have to learn it anyway if you want to learn the full breadth of the thinker's work. I think what else we can go into here. I think that's about it. Yeah, it's going to be it. So I'm going to go over one more time. We have that dialectic of the life and death drive, which is that sustained contradiction throughout civilization within the individual. And it is that pulling towards that unity among man, that desire for happiness that I have longer lasting pleasure in civilization because there's that security. Versus, I want that sense of non-being. I want that sense of disunity. I want that sense of mythical fulfillment, which I can never have, because again, it is mythical fulfillment, which would be the state of nature. Again, civilization allows that actualization for that potentiality for man to work, to be a creative animal. Again, derived from Marx, and before that, Aristotle. And I think that's going to be about it. So yeah, this is Freud's theory of civilization. This video hopefully was more organized than my past ones, but yeah, so go ahead and subscribe down below and like the video, and tell me if you want to see more videos on Freud, or go into Lacan. Maybe skip Freud. We kind of touched on him enough. That's great and all, but let's get into some Lacan, you know. But either way, thank you for liking the video, and have a nice day.